we are in an early JK with an LS 5.3. The first conversion Motec did on a JK was an LS 5.3 all the way back in 2008. It was a 2008 JKU. It was pretty much a stripped down X or Sport with a hard top, air conditioning, a couple of options. And that swap worked out so well that we moved into a 6.2 shortly after. That first swap had stock tires, which I think were about 29 inch. It was a manual transmission. It had 323 gears. It was really light. Everything was plastic, the bumpers, the fenders. And the LS 5.3 worked awesome in that vehicle. It had plenty of power. It could cruise at 80, 90 miles an hour all day long. It got great gas mileage, pushing close to 20 on the highway. That vehicle is still on the road over a decade later, and it's pushing 300,000 miles. So the longevity of the 5.3 is excellent. Now on the other side, guys say, well, the LS 5.3 isn't a big step up from the Pentastar. You're going from 280 horsepower to about 320. It doesn't make a good engine in a heavy JK, a JK with 40s, etc., etc. And they're pretty much right. If you watch my videos on the LS 5.3 over the years, you know I like the engine, but I always suggest you put it in a light JK, a JK with smaller tires, something with less load. You can easily step up to an LS 6.0, LS3, or today an LT. So why get an engine that's 1.5 liters bigger than a 3.8? Well, the JK we're in pretty much breaks all the rules. It is heavy. It is black for cooling out here in the desert. It's got 40-inch tires and all sorts of stuff. The inside and the outside is loaded down with stuff. However, the customer really likes this engine. Why? Pretty much any V8 is a giant step up from the 3.8, especially when mated to the Chrysler 4-speed automatic transmission, is very pathetic in a modified JK. The LS 5.3 is a huge, massive step up from that. No, it's not an LT1 and it's not an LS3, but you can now cruise at 80 miles an hour with comfort. You are going to downshift. In fact, I'm on this little road right now going up these little hills, and you can probably hear the engine going from 6th to 5th. But the reality is you're holding your speed, and it's relatively comfortable. You're only picking up a couple hundred RPM. It's not like the 3.8 where the tack needle goes up 1,000 or 1,500 RPM when it downshifts. Back in the day, the LS 5.3 had significant advantages. One, it was extremely affordable. I remember picking up LS 5.3s for well under $2,000 with low miles on them. That has now changed. Getting LS 5.3s and 6.0s with low miles used is getting tough. These engines went end of life about 5 years ago. Two, the LS 5.3 can run regular gas. So those of you that want to run regular gas, you pretty much don't want to get a LS3 or even any of the high compression LT1s in my opinion. However, you guys also know my opinion about premium versus regular. If you get premium gas, it's going to perform better. And the reality is these LS 5.3s are still in the 9-point compression ratio area. So they're relatively high compression versus the last generation of small block. But it will run on regular gas. If you put premium in it, it's going to run better. A lot of people will take these LS 5.3s and 6.0s and mod them. They'll put high performance heads on them. They'll do the low ends, do high compression and all that. And yeah, I've had 5.3s with over 400 horsepower. I had one the other day that had headers and all sorts of mods done to it, and the thing ran pretty hard. I'd say harder than a 6.0, probably not as hard as an LS3, but the point is, why not just buy an LS3? Because if you have a cammed 5.3 with headers and all that stuff, you're probably spending more money than an LS3. The LS3 has better drivability because the extra displacement allows it to be more mild with any given cam. So I'm not a big fan of modding these engines to get more power out of them. Now a little bit of tweaking on the tune here and there, that's fine. High flow intake and exhaust, that's fine. And you'll see that these engines will push in the low to mid 300 horsepower level. The big advantage over the 3.8 is the torque, because you're over 300 foot-pounds of torque versus 200 foot-pounds of torque, which means there's a lot of situations where the 5.3 is comfortable where the 3.8 isn't. To be honest, if you're more the tortoise than the hare, and it's not about how fast you get there, but just getting there in comfort, you'd probably be happy with the LS 5.3. If you want to just hold the speed limit, if you don't tow, if you're not running at 10,000 feet, if your Jeep isn't all pimped out like the one I'm in right now, LS 5.3 is fine. there better options? Yes. Now in the old days I'd say, but they cost more money. Unfortunately, the LS 5.3 and the 6L80 have gone up in price to where now you're pushing LT 5.3 prices with an LS 5.3 swap. You can still get a used LS 5.3 with 100,000 miles for a pretty good deal, and that's not a lot of miles on an LS 5.3. Like I said, the shop LS 5.3 is going on 300,000 miles, so it's still probably going to outlast even a new 3.8 engine. The 6L80s, while there's a lot of them out there, GM raised the core price to, I think, $2,000, $1,500 or $2,000, and that really jacked the price up of these transmissions. So the days of picking up a good low mileage combo for $3,000 to $4,000 are over. However, they're still out there, and if you search hard enough, you can get one. Again, my advice would be, if you have a pretty ordinary JK without a lot of stuff on it, or you want to do expedition, which means you're not so concerned about performance, you're more concerned about reliability, torque, drivability, then get yourself an LS 5.3. The LS 5.3 is a half-ton SUV sport utility engine, which means it's US EPA compliant. If we step up to the 6.0, the 6.0 and the LS 5.3 are almost identical. The difference is the displacement. The 6.0 is just a larger engine. The 6.0 does have a iron block, which some guys like because of the durability. They did offer the LS 5.3 in both iron and aluminum. The old LY5 and the LMG are iron blocked. Now they do have their aluminum counterpart like the LC9, which is the most popular LS 5.3 that we find. I've heard that the aluminum engines have a little bit more horsepower than the iron engines. I'm not sure if that's true. They all seem to run pretty much the same to me. But the story on the LS 5.3 is, it is a great engine. It may not be the #1 choice, again, for a heavy JK, a JK with large tires. If we look at the JK I'm in, it's really heavy. We got roof things and 40-inch tires and stuff hanging off everywhere. So an engine with more displacement would more easily haul this vehicle. But if this vehicle had a 3.8 in it, it would be pure misery. Where with a 5.3, it's very tolerable. Just cruising along, you don't notice that much of a difference. But going up some of the grades, you're going to see the transmission downshift a bit. You're not going to have that throttle response that you would have with larger displacement engines when you get on it. It's probably going to be a little bit softer response, and then it's going to downshift before it goes. I remember towing a 5,000-pound iron worker from California to the shop in Vegas with our LS 5.3 JK, and the engine had no problem. It towed that 5,000 pounds pretty much effortlessly, even up the Baker grade. The problem really was the chassis. The chassis wasn't up to that weight. The sway, I don't think the early 08 had the trailer sway control in the electronics, but the brakes and the suspension and the chassis just aren't up to it. So don't tow more than your JK is good for. And I think Chrysler says 3,500 pounds. But again, putting a 3,500 pound trailer on an LS 5.3 and going up to high altitude in Utah or Colorado, you're going to definitely see the performance drop off. Because you're dealing with about 330 horsepower, you go up to 10,000 feet, you lose about 3% per 1,000 feet, so you lose 30%, you're down to 200 horsepower, which is essentially what the stock JK has. You get yourself an LT1 with a 10-speed, not only do you have more gears to choose from, higher compression, larger displacement, it's definitely going to tackle that job a lot better. But if the LS 5.3 is in your budget, and that's all you need, it still makes an excellent powertrain. But we're not doing a lot of LS 5.3 builds. It is on our executive order in California, so we've done a few over there. And if you consider the availability of the LT 5.3, we're talking 11-to-1 compression, 10-speed transmission. Definitely has a lot of advantages over the LS 5.3. Most guys and girls are willing to step up and pay the extra money and get the LT. So the disadvantages of the LS 5.3 are it doesn't have the horsepower or the torque of the higher technology engines like the LT 5.3 or the larger displacement engines, and that just makes sense. Maybe we're getting a little spoiled, but back in the 80s and 90s when V8s were putting out 150, 180, 200 horsepower, when the LS 5.3 came along with 300 horsepower, it was huge. Now we look back at the LS 5.3 and realize even though it was a big step up from the last generation of small block Chevy, it's not up to the standard of the newer LT engines. Not very much is. When you get direct injection and 11.5-to-1 compression and double the gears that we used to have in the old days in the transmission, there's significant advantages to that. So if the downside is it doesn't have the same horsepower and torque of the larger engines, the upside is economy, They get relatively good fuel economy. They're virtually bulletproof. These LS 5.3s, especially the iron ones, can go 250, 300,000 miles plus. I've seen camshafts wear out because guys don't change their oil, and the engines are still good after camshaft replacements. They can run on regular gas. I would, if you have an LS 5.3 or actually any swap, I would experiment with different grades of fuel. And guys, try to run the same fuel. If you run Shell, I find Shell is different than Texaco. Texaco is different than Arco. If you're the guy that runs really cheap gas, and one way to tell that is pull a spark plug. If it's got like a reddish primer color to it, that's probably pretty cheap gas with cheap additives. You want to see your spark plugs a straw or a tan color. These iridium plugs can go 100,000 miles and you don't pull them very often. Back in the old days, we used to read the spark plugs all the time because reading the spark plugs could tell us a lot about the mechanical condition of the engine and the tune, because when you got carburetors or the old port fuel injections, they're not as sophisticated as today operating systems with all the feedback control. So try running some mid-grade, monitor your spark knock. If you're getting a lot of spark knock with cheap fuel, you're probably going to spend more money by putting the cheap gas in than putting a better gas in, which will allow that spark adaptive or scalar to increase, which will increase the mileage of the engine. Because if that octane scalar goes up enough and you increase the miles per gallon enough, you're recovering the extra cost of the higher grade fuel and probably then some. About this JK, it was built a long time ago, not by Motec. It was a customer build in Texas. I'm going to say it's maybe 8 years old, maybe more, maybe a little bit less. This does have the Slick Rock mount. There's a guy, Jeff, Slick Rock Off-Road in Texas, that was making these mounts for the Aeroforce gauges. They're only 2 1/16 inch gauge. I since think he's dropped it or he's not around anymore. Slick Rock's not around, I'm not sure. We do have an ABS light on. We got a steering wheel that's off center, and I'm throwing some steering wheel irrationality codes. And of course, he's got all the stuff. S-Pods, switches, CBs. First time I've seen a radio locked up with a steel plate, but it's a highly modified JK. And again, this LS 5.3, while it may not be optimal for this Jeep, it does just fine. I'm cruising up the hump to Pahrump right now at the speed limit 65 in this heavy JK in the 5.3. I'm in 5th gear, but I'm holding the speed limit with ease, and it's not uncomfortable at all. I remember coming up this hill in my JK with a 3.8 and 32-inch Rubicon tires, and the engine not only struggled, it would downshift into 3rd, even into 2nd. Transmission was running hot. It was not a pleasurable experience. This is. So is the LS 5.3 obsolete? No, of course not, but the advantages of running it are getting chipped away. With the advances in engine technology today and the parts and supply demand of the old LS engines, you're seeing fewer and fewer of these engines on the road. We're going to hit the mountain with this thing, and we'll see you soon.